I'm Rich Sains, and you're listening to the Procurement Conversations Big Conversation. Join me as I talk to procurement leaders and industry specialists about the biggest issues facing our profession. So this week we're talking about Talent Wars, and we have Ben Paynter, Procurement Director at Burberry, and Martin Smith, who's the owner and founder of the Talent Group, host of the Talent Talks podcast. Make sure you're subscribed to that one. So in procurement, over the last few years, we've had this talent war. Procurement's been suffering from a talent shortage, people leaving, moving to other parts of the business. Martin, maybe come to you first. How are you finding the market? I mean, we're talking December 2023. It'd be interesting to understand where you see the market at the moment.
Yeah, sure. Well, firstly, thanks for having me back on the show, and good to see you both. Yeah, I mean, look, I think 2023 has been a very volatile year. I think whenever we start the year off, we will sort of try and predict the trends and where we're going to see sort of spike in activity in the market. But I think you kind of rip up the rule book in 2023, to be honest with you. I think for the first time in quite a while, it's been quite industry aligned. So there's been obvious markets, sectors where there's been more growth and natural attrition versus others where it's probably been a bit more stagnant or indeed a reluctance to sort of invest in people. I think most noticeably, our biggest growth market, certainly across Talent Drive, has been in the consultancy. FS space has been pretty resilient, and actually utilities and engineering. I think the latter one partly down to sustainability, which obviously I'm sure we'll talk about, and naturally that's a topic that's been very, very apt in 2023, but there's been huge investment in the ESG agenda on a wider pace, and that subsequently meant investment in staff, whereas sectors like retail and FMCG, and obviously the sector that Ben's working for Burberry, I would say those kind of sectors, there's been less growth and more around maintaining their current headcounts and current talent and looking to redeploy on projects. So yeah, it's definitely been a year to stay on our toes as recruiters, but I'd say it was industry focused.
And we've been hearing about this talent shortage for a few years now. Ben, what's your experience trying to get hold of talent?
I think that's a really good question. And again, thank you for inviting me on today, because it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. I think it's a lean function, procurement. So one of the things that has created that's an endemic problem is there's consistently underinvestment as a function. So the need to hit the ground running, all of these things that you're going to hear, and certainly something that Marty's going to hear regularly. I need someone that can hit the floor running. They want people who's coming fully formed. Very few functions are actually willing to do that level of investment into their team to make sure they're upskilling. And that's, I think, one of the primary reasons why there's this challenge. I think there's often a misalignment in terms of what are the necessary skill sets, what's expected at a different layer. You can read a job spec, something from a head of will almost sound the same as someone at a low level category manager. It just all requires the same skill set. Normally those skill sets are ones I think that are perhaps innate, that a lot of people will have. So one's talking about EQ, one's talking about commercial acumen. I think they're ones that can be sharpened, but in terms of actually them as a core attribute for procurement, they are integral. But I don't think that people put that effort into development. So in terms of it being a challenging and there being a war for talent, it's pretty much been like that for me. I'll probably say for the close to 10 years. Yeah, there's different dynamics that influence it. So in terms of what candidates want, there's a lot more ask in terms of things like their flexibility, their working, wanting to understand the growth, the ability to migrate across categories, even things like international travel. So those asks have slightly changed, I'd say, over the last couple of years. Certainly post-COVID, that's probably been the real thing I've seen, is actually the asks of the candidates. I think a lot of those other challenges, still residual challenges that have always been there.
And how are you seeing that, Martin?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think for me, it's around sort of, if I look at the businesses that I believe have done well in terms of attraction of talent and being able to get that investment, I think it's the rhetoric around actually being at the table to talk around the business as a revenue generator, and actually, rather than just around cost, looking at supplier risk management or looking at sort of, cost cutting and cost saving and this whole sort of lazy stereotype of procurement being the cost police. I think that's certainly an outdated view, but I think certain organizations need to be getting into that C-suite, and as I say, talking it from a revenue generation point of view rather than just we're here to sort of save you money. Yes, of course, that's imperative for procurement, but I think there's so much more. We've already talked about driving the ESG agenda, driving supplier risk, looking at the tech and AI around it and how those businesses procurement can be very much part of that. One of my sort of bugbearers, which I've talked about on other shows, is around procurement talking about needing a seat at the table. Make your own seat. That's my view. And they should be actually creating their own agenda end in their own piece to get that investment. And like I say, I think the CPOs and procurement leaders and peers of Ben's, I think that's where they've managed to be quite successful in doing. Obviously, certain market sectors, as I said earlier, are going to be stifled by investment, and you are going to be at the perils of your shareholders around being able to invest to a degree. But I think it's around procurement departments creating opportunities for themselves and then allowing that investment to happen.
What are the key skills procurement leaders are looking for at the moment? What are the hot categories?
So if you're talking about sort of core category expertise, I'd say that's going to be industry specific. So I've a background that's pretty heavy in retail. So the kind of things you're looking at there will be related to digital, e-com skills, supply chain and marketing. So they're the sort of core competencies that do it. Certainly from the indirect side of things, which is my core focus and has always been my core focus over the last 10 years plus. I think I did touch on it before. The one that I think is really hard to flesh out and really get a good scan in terms of people's competencies is regarding people's true commercial acumen. So going through the recruitment process, people saying what they've done on their CV, it's fantastic in terms of looking like they've got achievements, but it can be really hard to actually understand their ability to do what you're going to need them to do. So whilst it can be a helpful indicator of their potential, really understanding their core competencies and what they could do from that commercial acumen. I also touched upon the EQ point of view, that ability to build networks, that ability to influence people. You can rarely get a good understanding of someone until they're in the role doing it, which I think becomes quite challenging. For me, I think that's why there's so many people I speak to who often will just hire through their networks. They want that as a pre-found skill. They want that sort of vetting. I think a lot of people lean into that because those skills can be hard. They want to know on who it is and can be quite hard to assess those until someone has joined a role. So for me, I think they're the core ones. I put a lot of emphasis on actually the upskilling bit, and I touched upon before how I think that's a bit that's under-resourcing. One of the things when I'm talking to prospective candidates, both internally from within my own team, also the wider part of the business and external candidates, is that I'm willing to invest in upskilling people. I'm willing to understand where they've got areas that need to develop. It's so underplayed in terms of the importance on doing things. And whether my own team members longer term would be employee working with me, I just want there to be good professionals, good people with skills in procurement. I don't mind whether they work for me or not. It is a industry that has a really mixed profile, and part of that is because of the business perception of it, but also I think that people coming to the table often maybe don't have a rounded enough skill set to show the true capability that a procurement function can actually deliver, because perhaps individuals are not rounded individuals.
I guess you see that when you look at CVs. Some people have incredible CVs, but these projects you worked on, were you just in the room with everyone else when it was going on, or were you actually influencing and driving it forward? And there's a real gap between those two things, isn't there?
Definitely. I think you're right. And I think there's almost a bit of a trapdoor sometimes when you look at CVs, and Ben, I'm sure you're familiar with this as well. And someone will talk around being accountable for 100 million to spend, when actually dive into their CV, actually that was the whole addressable spend for the team. Actually, they were delivering 5 million of that or whatever. So I think sometimes it's almost scratching the surface to understand actually what did they lead, what did that individual sort of do. I agree with Ben, and I think touching on that, there's almost a two-pronged attack to what are people looking for at the moment, and maybe where that skills gap is. I think because of the shortage of talent, which we're all aware of, I think more increasingly people are looking at actually the EQ rather than the IQ of that individual. So what I mean by that is those sort of soft skills, being able to flex your comm style depending on who you're talking to, the professional curiosity in procurement, all those sort of softer skills and being concise with what you're sort of trying to deliver. I think businesses are looking increasingly for that rather than specifically, must have 10 years of software sourcing expertise or whatever it may be. Now, don't get me wrong, I think there are certain roles where they do need that technical experience more so because the category is immature or there's a big transformation project. They need someone in to do that. A lot of the time, actually, we've seen this year that's come from contractors. We've had a 17% increase in our interim contractors going into market because those businesses have wanted to do the try before you buy, and that's where they've sort of bought in the services of more of a technical operator. But I think more generally, particularly at the junior end of that sort of buyer up to kind of procurement manager, category manager level, I think people are actually going, do you know what? It doesn't actually matter what you've procured. It doesn't matter necessarily what you've been buying in the past. It's more around actually, as I say, do you have that wider soft skills piece and honing more in on that? And then they can invest in those individuals and develop them. And, you know, you guys know yourself, you could, within reason, you can learn a category, you can learn the kind of suppliers to go to. That also depends back to the maturity of that procurement function, because, you know, certain organizations don't have the time necessary to invest. So as I say, I think there's two angles there. I think there's still, like Ben said, a massive skills gap, in the sort of technology, that sort of IT space. I think CapEx has been another area this year where, again, there's been a bit of a skills gap in that area. Going back to the IT piece, what we're also seeing is people are migrating out of doing a permanent role when they get to a certain level in IT, and they'll go and do contracting because it's more commercially lucrative. They can go in on a project mindset, go and deliver that, and then move on. Rich, you know, that's also, you know, experience that you've had as well and know. So we're losing a lot of our top talent, particularly in that IT area, because they're going into doing contracting rather than carrying on up the food chain, as it were, to kind of heads off. So I think that's been another real challenge, and there's not enough talent coming in, which I'm sure we'll sort of cover today. But
on that contractor piece, Martin, I think one of the things that I've often seen, having worked with a lot, employed a lot, is often they're also underdeveloped. Once they move into that contractor landscape, I think it'd be really hard for them to get the investment, because people aren't going to invest their expensive resource. They've come in, they're doing a particular piece of job. So I think for contractors as well, there can be that need to look at moving back to a perm thing so they can get that development from working in the company, because they're going to do it. Because I've seen a lot of contractors almost like hit a ceiling of where they can get to, because people haven't been willing to invest in them, sort of like those leadership schemes, those development things, which becomes a ceiling even for them. And again, I want people to be able to do that. I have no problem with investing in contractors, broadening the stuff that they're getting exposure to. But the more costly things on behalf of business, either contractors are going to have to self-fund that if they want to help them set up the ladder further, or they need to probably look at that move to a perm role, even in the short term, if it's a view to longer term moving back to the contracting market.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I know it's something that we've seen a lot on talk this year on IR35 changes in legislation. Again, I think the narrative's just become really confusing. What's inside, what's outside IR35. I'm sure you guys know Mark Coulson. He talks very clearly and well around IR35 and what you're able to do and not do with it. But I think the contract legislation and also the directive from businesses has just been really contradictory. So a lot of interims just go, do you know what? It's too much hassle. I'm going to go back into the perm world. So we've also seen that. But I think it's scratching the itch sometimes for individuals to go and explore the interim route, to go and have that project mindset, go in and deliver. But you're right, actually, that's a really good point. A lot of those have also come back into the sort of permanent world, where there's natural skepticism from employers going, well, you've been contracting for X amount of years. It's quite hard to then go back into a permanent role where you're not so project, mindset. You are a little bit more around the long-term strategy piece.
On that, Martin, I think you touched upon a thing which comes back to some of the bit that we were talking earlier in, is procurement teams will often have a very specific view in terms of what they want to do and what they want to do with a role particularly, and are often not so open-minded. Like, you see these requirements and they're incredibly long, like lines and lines and lines in terms of expectations of what they want. But I would love to see more job specs, much more open, much less demanding about people, willing to look at people with sort of some experience of a thing, or even willing to work in it. Because I think a lot of people are shooting themselves in the foot with not being willing to do that.
Do you guys see enough coming through, though, from a talent pool point of view? Because I guess that's always been my concern, that there's not enough, businesses aren't growing their own enough, there's not really any real dedicated, particularly strong graduate programs that do, there's obviously the JLRs of the world that do fantastic procurement graduate schemes that are well known, but I see them as, dime a dozen, not exactly. They're quite scarce, aren't they, as a supplier? I don't know what you guys think, but
I'm indifferent to graduate schemes, just in general. I think they can be a useful means of getting people in at a certain level because they've got a sort of proven track record. I've always gone out of my way to try and make sure there's means and ladders to upskill people, because one of the core things that is why they often want people to hit the ground running can lead to almost like your credibility so you can get up to speed quickly. But it often glosses over the complexities of being able to work in an existing company. So you'll have internal people that know the quirks, they know the foibles of where they work. So not investing in them or not making sure that you've even got that opportunity, that pipeline for your own people, right from the most entry level roles up. It can be really challenging if you're doing that. So I like to put real effort into it. And coming back to that skill point, something that I've rarely seen is things like capability and competency frameworks mapped against what they expect of every level. So people don't even know where they need to develop themselves. They're not working with their managers against a clear framework that gives them an indication of, you're at this level, you're doing great at these skills. Actually, these are the kind of ones which you need to develop when you want to get to the next level. Then when people at the next level, it's like, how do you progress above that? And it's something that I've done in my current role, my previous role, and it's been really helpful. It's like really helped set the scene with those people about their own aspirations, about their career, and helps them, I think, have a more realistic view in terms of where they are, where those key elements are for them from a development point of view. And it's taken so much time because there isn't an industry standard to look at how you map it. So every time I've had to work to create it in terms of what I think of the groups. And I'd love to, again, more people to really understand what they are. We talked already about the difficulty in differentiating between job specs and also CVs. You could just scrub people's titles off of it. You could scrub them off of job specs, not really have any idea what level people are operating at, their skills or their things, because it's so hard to differentiate.
And I think just on that point as well, I think it also procurement sometimes confuses itself by the amount of words and language described on job titles. You can be a strategic sourcing manager somewhere, or a procurement buyer. You can be a procurement buyer on $100,000 a year somewhere, and you can be a strategic sourcing manager, in another business on $30,000 a year. And there's a procurement lead and a category lead, and we talk about category managers, and is that aligned to it? So I just think it's very confusing sometimes with the amount of wording and language used. And I agree with you, Ben. I think we need to simplify that. Actually, let's talk around the nuts and bolts. So what is that role? What are they owning? What's the maturity like of that business? What is the day-to-day expectations? Is it supplier rationalization? Is it looking at risk management? Is it looking at the strategic sourcing element? What is it? And actually just going into that on a job spec, rather than this generic, need to be computer illiterate and 8 years of this, and it's just waffly stuff. And I think if we can improve that and improve that language and be a bit more consistent, I think that's the thing as well. It's consistent across businesses of what they recognize as procurement and what it should be doing and shouldn't be doing. I think it will sort of lend itself to more people, and it'll be a more of an attractive area. Because let's be clear, I say this all the time, when people go into procurement, they rarely leave it. I fell into recruitment. Most procurement people fall into the profession, but once they're in there, you very rarely see procurement people move outside of it. They do tend to retain talent very well, from my experience. So I think they're just sort of missing a trick in getting that consistency.
Which teams are getting this hiring talent thing right, and what is it that they're doing differently to other people?
Well, I think firstly the consistency of the language. That if they call them strategic sourcing specialists, and then managers, and then heads of sourcing, etc., I think that helps, and being really clear with how that works. Where does SRM sit? Is that embedded in procurement, or is that a separate entity? Where does the contract management sit? I think if they're clear and defined on what is actually involved in the day-to-day procurement and what isn't, then it creates a really clear route to market, a really clear external message. So I think for me, that's the sort of number one. I think also it's the businesses, they're actually talking around investment, they're talking around innovation, they're talking around diversity in terms of their suppliers, they're talking around ESG. They're actually proof in the pudding on those, not just throwing buzzwords in for the sake of it. They're actually living and breathing those
driving that agenda.
Driving that agenda, exactly.
Martin, you touched on a couple of things which I've seen increasing demand through. So not through necessarily my own team, my own desires there, but certainly touching on things like the ESG, CSR commitments, about how there's a real appetite for procurement to drive them. Interesting thing is, it's always an ask on those things, like, you must have done this. I've never seen people like saying how they're going to help, how they're going to develop and say that this is emerging. Some of the ESG obligations, they're so new and so fresh that I don't know how these organisations think someone's even going to have that experience to be able to do it. I think you need to be able to create roles you can ring fence to let people become experts in that phase, rather than, again, going to market. I think that drives that that sort of mindset about the war on talent is, let's just go out and get it. Let's not sort of foster it. Let's not just invest in it, that you could just go and get it from another company, another organization. There's always going to be a need for that. There's always a benefit in going to market, but there's also a benefit in that development piece of your own team, making sure that you've got some of those skills, that you're providing career pathways. So that's a challenge that I've particularly seen, because when I've seen these job specs, I thought, I'm not even sure I'll be able to recruit that when I've looked at some of those things that other organizations are doing. Like, they want some really niche roles that are relatively new and quite embryonic as a procurement type role, as a procurement skill set. So I would sort of come back to you then, Martin. I'd love to see, like, as you doing the recruitment role, how much more have you seen those kind of elements as a demand as part of a role, and actually how prevalent is that as actually a tangible experience that people have got on their CVs or people can really credibly talk about?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think it firstly comes down to attitude. I think it's very difficult for businesses to maybe justify investing in a 60, 70 grand plus person that's going to be dedicated to sustainability if they haven't really done a lot in it yet. But I think it's just attitude. So what I mean by that is those individuals that are genuinely passionate about sustainable sourcing. Ideally, they've tangibly done something around it before, but they actually have a real vested interest in that and helping promote that in their business. Goes back to the diversity piece as well. Modern day procurement professionals, to be ahead of the curve, to be that real creme de la creme in the market, what do you need? You need to be tech savvy. You need to understand creating diverse supply chain, and you need to understand and have a passion for the ESG agenda. I think they are the three things for me over anything else that you have to be able to demonstrate. The kind of commercial acumen around driving savings and contract, supply risk management, or whatever that may be. Yeah, that's kind of a given. But those three things, if we can achieve that and get those three things off the mark for individuals and have that right attitude, and that go back to the whole EQ side of things rather than IQ, that is the head of the curve. That is the number one thing that organizations that we represent are interested in. The other bits will come as a secondary point, the category knowledge, etc. But they are the pieces. Now, if that individual actually has done it in the past and they can demonstrate that, amazing. But I think at this stage, while we're on that journey, while we're still on that ESG agenda and still on that journey, it's just around the attitude and the appetite.
Are there many truly strategic teams out there, or a lot of people just talking a good game?
Poor Ben, I'll let you answer that to start with.
The context is the teams are out there in the marketplace. They're trying to attract this talent. Are they just sort of spinning a yarn when actually they're not quite what they say are?
I don't think that's something you can generalise. I definitely think there will be organisations that part of their fishing hook to try and attract talent is talking about and perhaps overplaying how strategic their function is, how big a seat they've got at the table. But there will be those at the other end where they do have all of that stuff, and actually it's entirely true. I think that can be a difficulty for people assessing their roles that they want to go to, what they're looking for, because it can actually be quite hard, I think, to differentiate between the reality of the pitch to them about an organisation. And I definitely think this is going to be a thing that Martin would have experienced, is even people he's dealing with and those organisations will be doing their sales pitch to Martin, knowing that Martin and his colleagues are going to have to do this pitch again. And I bet there's been loads of times that Martin's had it where a candidate has gone through his process, they've heard all this great stuff, they've landed there to find out some of those realities of those expectations were very different from how they've been talked to in terms of whether that's the strategic, the nature of the role, etc., to once they've landed and actually finding that it is quite different, and perhaps it's not the role that, or the organisation, or the maturity they were hoping to get through going to that organisation, and can probably be quite disappointed. So yes, there will definitely be people and organisations that are playing it up, but there'll also be loads that are, and probably are slightly complacent or aren't reflective of how good a role they are in comparison to some of these peer sets, and aren't selling themselves because they're almost like taking it as isn't all procurement departments like this? Is this something we actually have to talk up? There's a real credible position for us. So yeah. I think you get both of those and anywhere in between that scale.
I think the litmus test, Rich, is when you can talk to an individual. If a CPO, procurement director, proclaims that they are a strategic function, I think that you can, if they can clearly and coherently talk through a 3-5 year plus strategy and actually sort of say, this is where I see the procurement department in our business being. This is aspirationally what we're looking to achieve. This is where we are now. And I think having some truth and real authenticity around actually where they are in their maturity scale and curve, and actually where we want to be in 3 years and where we want to be in 5 years. If that's a clear message and it's an honest message, for me, they're businesses we want to partner with. And for me, that is demonstrating at least an attempt to be strategic. The ones that just throw a load of business jargon and can talk you through a 7-step process, great, but how are you actually utilizing that? How are you actually bringing that to market and the individuals in your team? And are you actually living and breathing by that? Because like you say, there is a lot of that business jargon and a lot of sort of superlatives around how wonderful these businesses are and, you know, what they've done. If they can actually demonstrate and talk that through, I think that's the piece for me. And any candidates that are assessing, you know, through interview processes and from what they're reading on websites for these different organizations, that's the key message. Can they talk clearly around that plan?
On that, because you deal with a lot more procurement functions than me, there's that slight irony there. Is how much, though, is that actually something that candidates want? Because I know from my own experience, I don't necessarily want to go to like some enormous FMCG or some super mature thing. Because one of the things as a more senior person is I like that ability to influence shape. So things like greenfield sites, brownfield, and I'd say that's even for people lower than that. It could be more exciting, more compelling, depending on your own personal aspirations. That I don't think that a procurement person should necessarily have to or want to go to this amazing fully formed thing, because it might not be as exciting or as compelling for them to do it. And do many candidates actually proactively look for that? Because I know I certainly would.
Yeah, I mean, I think that comes down to sort of the maturity and experience of the individual. I think the more, generally speaking, the more experienced procurement professionals want to go into something that's broken or want to go into something that's greenfield or brownfield that has a real immaturity around it to actually go in and help and shape and develop it. I think probably more at the buyer, senior buyer level, they probably want to go into something a little bit more mature. They can learn more. They can be invested in other categories, learn from other peers that are setting the strategy and really working in that more strategic and systematic way. But I would agree. I think certainly when you start going to heads of category and head of procurement, etc., I think actually immature greenfield sites are the creme de la creme. That's the number one hook over anything. And then almost secondary to that is the flexibility in terms of the working pattern, which is still there. That's probably another podcast episode in itself of flexible working and how that's transitioned since the pandemic. And then of course pay, salary, bonuses, and etc. That's probably the third key aspect. It's still an important part, but maturity certainly is a massive part of that. And actually, if those strategic functions aren't strategic and they are immature and they do great, then share it. Let's be honest around it. And actually, I think you'd actually find you get more candidates. You get more of a wider pool of people being really interested in that.
You mentioned there the work from home hybrid working position. Has that settled down now? Because obviously there was a bit of a flux after the pandemic, but what are you seeing in the market around that?
Well, I think there was a hangover, right? There was a lot of people that were hiring during the pandemic and putting people on home-based contracts. And the challenge is a lot of organizations got these big, expensive buildings in the cities and, huge overheads and having to sort of pull people back in to justify that cost. And there was obviously a resistance and reluctance for certain individuals. Obviously, it depends on personal circumstances. But I think generally speaking, organizations are trying to get people back to a 2 and 3 or a 3 and 2 in terms of week. That's what we're generally seeing. Some are more flexible than that. I think the ones that are massively failing, and this is purely in my opinion rather than necessarily data, but I think the ones that are failing are the ones that are trying to get people back in 5 days a week. I think that's counterintuitive of everything. My belief is that procurement, being a commercial function, do need to be visible and do need to see stakeholders, but absolutely not 5 days a week. And similarly, I wouldn't say many procurement roles can be done effectively on completely home based, never see your colleagues. I think they're almost the two extremes. So generally speaking, probably 70% of our client base now are doing a 2 and 3 or 3 and 2 hybrid working. But it's been really interesting, the fallout from coming out of the pandemic when certain individuals are being more resistant to that, which has been a real headache for procurement leadership.
Martin, a question on that, actually, this is a curiosity one for myself, is have you seen any difference between sort of the ages or experience of the candidates, between resistance to go back to the office or those preferences? Is there a difference between
definitely
and ages of people? Like, how does that play out?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point. I would say, generally speaking, the individuals that haven't got, children and those that perhaps are free and single, and maybe the younger generation, the ones that have been more happy to go back. I think naturally we've all, everyone's got families on this podcast, have all naturally had those other commitments which you kind of get used to, right? When you're in the pandemic, you get used to sort of doing the nursery drop-offs and be able to sort of do those other things. We're kind of probably a little bit spoiled with that. So I think those people have probably been a little bit more resistant to flex with their personal sort of circumstances and lives. Certainly my friends that haven't got children were happier to go back into the city than those of us that did. So yeah, I think that's probably a fair comment than the more experienced people were a little bit more resistant of that. And actually that's why quite a few people went into the contracting market, because they could be on home-based contracts. And interesting as well, in consultancy, a lot of our consultancy clients put people on home-based contracts, and then they only need to go into that project site specifically when the end client asks them to. So that's been a real attractive tool for them, which is why we've seen some good growth in that space as well.
Yeah, I saw the other day it was advertised as a hybrid contract, and it was 4 days a week in the office. I thought that's what we used to do sort of 10 years ago. It was like you have a work from home on a Friday or whatever. It's sort of hardly a new thing really, but yeah, it's interesting how people try to spin some of these things.
But 4 days I wouldn't describe as hybrid, no.
No. And when I was in procurement leadership, it was, if someone was in the office 5 days a week, you'd always be saying to them, well, why aren't you with your suppliers or your stakeholders or whatever? You should be traveling around and taking some time to do your deep work at home. And then the stakeholder FaceTime is in the office. But it was always sort of looked down on really to people who are in for 5 days a week.
You still need those sort of water cooler conversations, and still having those sort of things that you don't get on the Teams call or the video call.
On that water cooler moment, though, that was sort of seen as the critical thing. And I think what a lot of people have done is go back to the office and spend their time on Teams. The water cooler moment, you need to make that happen.
Yeah, so right.
Sure you're up and about around the office, trying to engage with people, trying to do something. So being in the office just won't make water cooler moments happen. You actually have to go out of your way to still make sure you're speaking to people, even if it's just wandering around, making cups of tea, just doing it, trying to bump into people. You get those ad hoc conversations. So if you go in and just have that structured thing, you're not going to generate that. And I don't see there being any real benefit unless you're trying to make things occur when you're in the office.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. And I'm, on a personal level, I make my Mondays when I'm in the office with the team exactly that. I'm with the team and I'm doing the one-to-ones, face-to-face, end-of-year reviews we've just had for our team. And I'm doing it face-to-face and seeing them and having a coffee and asking how they are and how's your family, and just getting that more engagement with the individuals. I think it's really important. And I totally agree. If you're going to go into an office and just be on Teams calls all day, you might as well do that from home. And, it doesn't make sense at all. Maximize your time when you're with people to do exactly that, be with the people.
Yeah. Is there anything that candidates should be doing that they're not doing, in your opinion?
I think talking around what they're accountable for doing, I kind of touched on it earlier around actually what projects are they sort of proud of, and actually where have they shown genuine innovation. My advice would be the candidates that sort of just talk around what I'd call the obvious procurement activity. You don't almost need to put it on your CV. It's kind of taken as a given that you understand, contract law or you've worked around risk management. That's a given because of the role you'd naturally be in. I think where people sometimes miss a trick is, like I say, talking around a project that they're really proud of and they've shown some innovation rather than just they've renewed terms with X client or X supplier. I think the other thing as well is actually talk around successes with people. There's a lot of procurement directors and CPOs that I deal with, and they send me their CV and they talk around, I've managed $1 billion spend and we've had this big transformation I've delivered. And that's all really great. But actually, have you had any people in your team that have been internally promoted? Is anyone that's actually taken a leadership role in your function that maybe started as a buyer and you've developed? Talk around individuals that you've made successive. It's not just around spend. It's not just around projects. It's around people. And I think that's the biggest bit of advice I'd give, which I think a lot of candidates sometimes miss off their CV, and indeed when they're interviewing as well. What was your thoughts, Ben? Yeah, you look at a lot of CVs as well.
One of the things that I think a lot of candidates often don't consider is there should be a level of reciprocity. It's important that it is a two-way street, that you're making sure that you understand that what you're going to get from this potential future employee, you've got to make sure it's going to align to actually what you want. I've had enough candidates come in who aren't prepared to ask questions that are much more pertinent to themselves. A lot of people come prepped with trying to understand about the organizations. They might ask about strategy and stuff. And it is fantastic to see that, to see people have done their prep about the future organization. But I really like it that when candidates have a clear view in terms of sort of like their wider breadth, their wider aspirations, what they want to do that's going to make them happy, because there's nothing worse than it not working out. We sort of mentioned it earlier, but it's important for people that they're really comfortable that they're going to definitely get what they want from a future employer. And likewise for me, it helps me understand, like, what's this person going to need when they land? Like, actually, I can start to give it some thought. So someone coming in saying they want to understand this, I can think, actually, is there flexibility within the role? Does it just have to be as ring fenced as it is? This person seems like a great candidate. I want to make sure they want the role, because that's the other thing. War and talent, you need to make sure that you're offering something compelling, which might be much more personalized to individual candidates than actually, how do I make this company or this role compelling? It's actually, how can I make this compelling for this specific person? What are the tweaks or the items I want to do for them, which aren't necessarily going to be, there's a sign-on bonus or we'll do that. It's actually, what will really make it compelling for them.
It's a really good point, Ben. I totally agree. I think that's a really progressive way of looking at your sort of candidate attraction strategy, because it's not just about pay. It's not just about salary. It's around those other things, whether that's the flexibility piece, whether that's getting involved in, ESG projects, whether that is looking at other categories. Maybe I want to, my experience is in the corporate services, but actually I really want to know more about direct procurement. And actually, is there opportunities to work on those sort of projects? So I think that agility of thought is the real progressive leaders are able to do that. But again, I think sadly that's probably a bit more the minority than the majority right now. The majority will still say we pay our 20% bonuses every year, which is great, but there needs to be a little bit more than that for modern day procurement, in my view.
Great. So next question, going to cover some annoying practices. So this is candidates, recruiters, and hiring managers. So if we start with Ben, what are the annoying practices that you find people like Martin do in the industry? Obviously not Martin, but just other recruiters.
Unsolicited emails and CVs is probably my absolute pet hate. But that's more about thing. I think that does a disservice to the great work that a good recruitment consultant can really do. I think that's damaging to it. We talked more about like procurement raising their profile and stuff. I think unfortunately there's a lot of bad recruitment consultants who damage the wider piece and actually perhaps don't do the best service in terms of helping you get candidates or helping you think why you should pay the price you pay for them. Like, it's not cheap to use a recruitment consultant, but it can be very good value in terms of taking that workload, finding you excellent candidates and stuff. So it is important that I think recruitment consultants do take that into account when they're doing it. So that's my pet hate, is that unsolicited CVs. But other than that, I think sometimes I've felt that there can be a disconnect where you'll have relatively junior recruitment consultants who are pitching themselves already as knowing the industry inside out. And they're talking to people at my level as though they understand it as much as I do, or they've had that level of experience. They do themselves a disservice from a credibility point of view. There's nothing wrong with anyone actually saying, this is the level I am, asking questions to learn, to understand that. You go through that journey quicker and then develop your credibility and not have to sort of maybe lay it on thick about how much you know that's just been what you've been told rather than what you've learned.
So Martin, hiring managers like Ben, but not Ben.
You said you weren't going to mention that unsolicited email, Ben, I sent you. No, I would kind of add to Ben's. I think the challenge we've had in recruitment this year is it's been tougher. It's been harder. When we came out of the pandemic, a lot of organizations that had furloughed people were then reinvesting. So we had 18 months, like any recruitment business in any sector, where it was a real purple patch. There's a lot of investment, a lot of growth, a lot of recruitment. I think 2023, for the reasons we've discussed today, has been harder. It's been harder to find talent, and there's been a reluctance to pay agency fees. To Ben's point, we're not cheap. We add value, but ultimately sometimes it does come down to price, and they want to do it in-house. There's been a lot of investment in TA functions and internal recruiters, LinkedIn, the tech that's involved now. There's accessibility to sometimes find good talent directly and not use agencies. What we found is some recruitment agencies, because of that, and because they've got large teams that they need to feed jobs, they cheapen the process. They cheapen themselves as a service offering and lower their price point down. So we'll go to, we've had examples this year with both clients that we work with and indeed prospective clients where we've approached them and they said, look, we'd love to work with you. However, X agency have said that they can do it for, it's anecdotal, but 5-10%, whatever, less than what you guys are offering. So I can sit here and talk very confidently around the value that myself and my network can bring. But sometimes when it does come down to price, we've got certain, businesses in our field and indeed wider that are cheapening themselves by lowering their price point down. Long term, that will not benefit them. Use that as a procurement analogy with your suppliers. If you hammer your suppliers down so low, the value and the quality of service will obviously diminish over time. You might get some wins in the short space, but long term it diminishes. So that's my biggest bugbearer in organizations and agencies that are doing that, because it's cheapening the profession, it's cheapening their service, and it's not adding value. And then they'll do a rubbish job, and then there'll be a reputation which will carry on being embedded of recruitment agencies are all just the same thing. Throw CVs at the wall, see what sticks. So yeah, for us, that's been the biggest challenge and definitely my biggest bugbearer.
The hiring managers, what are you seeing there? Any annoying practices?
So annoying practices, I think when they say we need someone tomorrow and they laugh and go, we needed that person filling the role yesterday, and then I guess we send CVs and then they sit on them for 3 weeks. That's probably one of my biggest things. That is the minority, not the majority, thankfully. I would have lost my sanity by now, but yeah, I think that's the thing. It's misalignment on expectations. It's saying one thing and actually doing something slightly different. So I think just understand the urgency on roles is really helpful tool and tip for anyone here that's working with an agency or thinking about doing it. I think just managing those expectations like you would do with any of your suppliers or internal stakeholders, just being really clear and living and breathing those sort of timeframes that you've sort of given in the first place. Because that could be really challenging, because the market moves, this year, probably above all, candidate is king. We've talked around that war on talent on this conversation, and the very best candidates move very, very quickly. We're talking, sometimes less than a week turning around from them deciding they want to leave, them sending their CV to Talent Drive, and then them actually getting a job offer can actually be has literally been within sort of 4 or 5 days at times. Now, that's extreme, but generally in weeks they'll be off the market as quickly as they're on.
Okay, and I guess to both of you, what annoying practices are you seeing from the candidates?
Obviously, as a hiring manager, I probably don't want to be too disparaging about it and deter any prospective excellent candidates with anything. One of the things I think that candidates don't do enough of is be curious about a job when they're relatively comfortable in their role. The real good and most exciting, compelling opportunities won't come up necessarily when you're ready to move. You've got to keep your eye on the market the whole time. Like, the right role might be out there. So I'm not saying like constantly proactively looking, but do always have one eye open to make sure that you're geared up to do it. Because for me as a hiring person, is quite often when I've gone through the circuit, like someone like Martin or any of his peers, a lot of their CVs are people who are like really heavily proactively looking for work. So if I've engaged someone, I might get that CV. They might apply directly to it. They might apply through LinkedIn. And I think they're doing themselves a disservice in terms of their own capability if they're over applying themselves in terms of how they're going to market, how they're cherry picking. I think as well, candidates need to really get honest with themselves about what they need or what they want out of the role. And it not just necessarily be about the package. Like, what are the wider things you're looking at? What are going to set you up for success? What's going to make you really happy in your next role, supporting your career within procurement? Because I've heard it so many times from people about, it doesn't sound compelling why they're looking for a job, just saying like, I want more money or stuff. I think people need to make sure they've got a really good narrative about why they're looking for it. And there's nothing wrong as well. I like people saying to me, why should I come and want to work for you? Or why should I come and want to work at your company? And that's the kind of stuff I touched on before about that curiosity. I want to see that curiosity. I want to know that this is a person who's actually really evaluating what they're doing. And it's not just going to be, oh, here's an offer, come through, etc., and I'll just take whatever comes through. I want to understand, because that plays back into that skill set. So someone who's curious, someone who knows what they want, someone wants to make sure it's the right opportunity for them, that kind of thinking consideration is exactly the kind of stuff that will make someone a good procurement person.
Totally agree. Yeah, I'd echo that. That was exactly mine as well, is honesty. It's just about being transparent with where you're at. If you are passively looking, but you're interested in that brand because of X, Y, and Z, great. Similarly, if you're, had a fallout with your boss for whatever reason, just, own it, be authentic with it, be honest about it. And I'd much rather work with those candidates that give us that full honesty and transparency. Similarly, in terms of where they're interviewing, they might not want to disclose all the information, but just so we're aware of the time frame so we can manage that effectively with our client. I think that's really key. That's all we ask for with our candidates. We're not expecting to take every job opportunity that we present, but if they can be honest and open and upfront around the timings, where they're at with everything, and what those real reasons are, to Ben's point of actually, why is it you're looking? Are you just professionally curious? Are you actually active because of X, Y, and Z? That's the piece over anything else that I think differentiates a candidate we struggle with versus one that we've got, we like working with, and it's reciprocated, right? We'll be honest with them about the client and what's going on, and we just ask for that in return.
And I think there's a good thing you can overlay similarities with running a supplier selection process here, in terms of where you're doing it for the right reasons, how you're doing it with integrity, because everyone wants to feel like it's fair, much in the same way as candidates don't want to feel that they've just been set as the stalking horse to go through the process. They're giving up their time and effort for this. It's only fair that you don't sort of do let's just get someone in the mix to see if it is, or we've got a thing. I genuinely would only want to go to market when I'm open-minded about what I'm doing, and that anyone I interview or I speak to theoretically could get the job. I don't want to go into a process with someone in preference. And that's, I think, important for candidates as well, is you need to make sure that you're going to these things with credibility when you're going to go and speak to people. Don't just go to job interviews for the sake of job interviews, in terms of like, oh, I've maybe got a job opportunity internally. Go, because you'll also take up time of a Martin, you take up time of a me, you take up time of recruitment teams, etc. So it is important, that credibility thing. So everyone who's worked in procurement was going to have run a process at some point that is far from optimal. And the frustration that creates, either internally or with the suppliers or the incumbent, etc., they're all unhealthy things. You've got to make sure if you're running a process, whether it be procurement or recruitment, it is fair and fit for purpose for all parties involved.
Yeah, totally agree. And just a final point I'll add to that as well is the biggest gift you can give a candidate is feedback, good or bad.
Yeah.
And again, I see it so much on LinkedIn, and my heart sinks when you see these people that are like, I've been in a process for 3 weeks and they've just given me a stock answer of sort of, you're a no, we've got more suitable candidates. To Ben's point, you're giving up time, right, to invest in these interviews, whether that's remotely or face to face. Give tangible feedback. It's really embarrassing for us when we're having to go back to candidates saying that you're a no and there's nothing else I can kind of share. So I think that's my biggest probably bugbear above anything, and just ensuring that a good quality recruitment process means that a hiring manager gives good feedback that the candidate can learn from, both good and bad. Actually, I had a client of the week who the candidate was a yes, and they accepted the job offer, and they gave feedback of, actually, this is what we liked. This is why we offered you, because you said this, and this. These really resonate with us. These are areas to improve and work on. And when you join us, that's a great answer. Isn't that that's the kind of businesses that people want to work for, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent feedback. It's feedback. It's areas that individual can work on. It's really, really important.
Because it might not work immediately, but in a year or two's time, you might want to be going back. And those ones that have treated you well, you'll think of them more fondly than the others.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both for joining, and make sure you're following Ben and Martin on LinkedIn, and obviously subscribe to Talent Talks podcast as well. Thanks for joining today.
Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Rich. It was a great chat.
Good to see you, Ben.
Cheers. Good to see you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Do like and share and subscribe to hear the next procurement conversation.